Here's some help to get you along on the Earthquake and Earth's Interior Lab, lab number 14. It starts out on pages 114 and 115 with a look at how P and S and surface waves travel through Earth's interior. So let's take a look at this figure right here a little closer. Here's the epicenter of an earthquake. And actually, there's the hypocenter. The hypocenter is where the earthquake initiates, and the epicenter is the location on Earth's surface above where the earthquake initiates. When the earthquake occurs, waves of energy are sent outward radially in all directions. And as you've learned, there are actually several waves that are sent out. There are P waves or primary waves, S waves or secondary waves, and those are both body waves that travel through the body of the Earth, as shown here, in all directions. And then there are surface waves, which only travel along the surface of the Earth. So if you have a seismic recording station here recording this event, the P waves will arrive first because P waves are the fastest, the S waves will arrive second, and the surface waves will arrive last. And so the recording in this station might look something like this. First there's the recording of background noise, which is pretty much 0. Then the P waves arrive. And then in this case, we have minute marks with the red lines. So 1, 2, 3 minutes later, the S waves arrive. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 minutes after the S waves, the surface waves arrive. And what you can notice is that the surface waves have the highest amplitude. The surface waves actually do the most damage of all of the waves that are sent out from an earthquake. So that's a picture of what's going on at Seismic Recording Station 1. Let's look at Seismic Recording Station 2. We also have the same scenario where the P wave arrives first, the S wave arrives second, and the surface waves arrive third. What you'll notice is that there's a longer time gap between the P and the S waves. Up here, there was a 3-minute time gap, and down here we have a 1, 2, 3, 4-minute time gap. And this is something that we can use to identify how far away the earthquake is. And this is epicenter location. And we're going to skip that part of the lab because this is really something that takes a little bit of time to understand. It's really a very hands-on activity. So this is activity 2 in the lab, and we're going to skip it. Don't worry too much about understanding that, except that there is a relationship between the time between when the P and the S wave arrive and the distance that station is from the actual epicenter. Again, though, the order is always P, S, and then surface waves. Down here we have a scenario where the P wave arrived and we haven't even had the S or surface waves arrive yet. So the first question in activity 1 asks you to look at this seismogram over here that's recording some earthquake waves. We don't know how far away the earthquake is. We just have the squiggles on the seismogram paper. How many minutes have elapsed between the arrival of the first P wave and the first S wave? So we have to look at these minutes here and try to figure out exactly when the two waves arrived. So I drew a blue line here. The first P wave arrived kind of between these 2 minute marks. And the first S wave arrived between these 2 minute marks. If we count the time between them, it's about 5 minutes. So the answer here would be 5. 5 minutes have elapsed between the arrival of the P and the S wave. The next question asks you how many minutes elapsed between the arrival of the P and the first surface wave. So I've drawn where I believe the first surface wave arrived, and so you're going to just count from here over to here. It looks like 2 additional minutes, so I'll let you do the math. Similarly, this next question asks how much time elapsed between the S and the surface wave. You should be able to figure that out. Question 4 is a little bit different though. It's asking about the maximum amplitude or the wave height of the surface waves compared to the maximum amplitude of the P waves. So remember that amplitude is wave height. So if we have a 0 line or a still water line, if we're thinking about ocean waves, amplitude is the deviation of a wave from that 0 point. And if we're looking at the maximum amplitude, we want to say, what was the greatest distance that a wave got from that 0 line? So we might say, well, this wave here is the farthest away from the 0 line, and then we want to measure that distance. Or we might think, well, maybe this one actually was farther, and we measure that distance. If we're not sure, we compare those distances and we say which one's farther, and then we know which one of these two is the greatest. And this is actually just asking you about the relative size, so you don't even have to do any measuring. As I said, we're going to skip activity 2. It really is a great use of seismic waves to understand where earthquakes are located, but it does take a bit of time to understand. I usually like to have students work on this for a week or two to kind of get the idea behind it, so we're not going to work on that. And we're going to skip to activity 3. Now, activity 3 focuses on this map here of earthquakes, and the key here is to look at the color. In blue, we have shallow earthquakes in the shallow crust. In yellow, we have intermediate level earthquakes, and in red, we have deep earthquakes. So this activity is very short. It's just got 4 questions. Use the figure to answer the following. Do most deep focused earthquakes occur along the margin of the Atlantic or the Pacific Basin? If you don't know your oceans, you do need to get a map, but the Atlantic Ocean is here, and the Pacific Ocean is here, and basin is just another word of saying the ocean. The oceans are in basins. So we can see that along the edges of the Atlantic, we don't even really have earthquakes along the margins. And then along the margins of the Pacific, we definitely have lots of earthquakes. The question is asking about deep focus, which are the red ones, and I think it's pretty clear that most of these red ones are around the Pacific Basin. Do the earthquakes that occur along the western margin of South America, which is right here, get deeper or shallower inland from the Pacific? So here's the Pacific, and going inland would go to the east. So I think you can answer these questions just by looking carefully at the map as you look at the questions and find exactly where they're talking about. Again, if you're not sure, find a regular map, make sure you understand what part of this they're looking at. Number 2 asks you, at what depth do earthquakes in the middle Atlantic Ocean occur? That's here, and there are blue ones, so I think you can figure that out. What geologic features are the earthquakes in the mid-Atlantic Ocean associated with? So what is the reason that we have these blue earthquakes here, these shallow earthquakes? And then what is the name of the zone of greatest seismic activity? And this is the region that goes around the Pacific Ocean, and I'm actually going to give you that answer. It is the Circum-Pacific Belt. And I didn't write it in here, but Circum-Pacific Belt is the answer to number 4. Activity 4, which is the last activity, asks you about questions of Earth's interior that we've determined based on seismic waves traveling through the Earth. So there's some introductory material here talking about the crust, mantle, and core, and then also further explaining the lithosphere and the asthenosphere, which we've talked about in class, and the outer and inner core, which differ because one is liquid and one is solid. So you want to study this little diagram here because it's going to help you with the rest of the questions. So activity 4 primarily asks about this diagram over here, figure 9. And this is a little bit confusing sometimes when students first look at it, so I want to make sure that it's clear. First of all, this left half here with this globe, cutaway version of the globe, you can ignore it, actually. This is supposed to help, but really you're looking at this graph right here. That's really what you're looking for. The graph has depth on the y-axis from the surface down to the center of the Earth. And then along the y-axis, we have the speed of seismic waves in kilometers per second. Velocity is speed. This is just showing you a three-dimensional view of the Earth, so you realize that this top brown layer is the lithosphere, the very thin lithosphere on the scale. This dark red area here is the asthenosphere. This lighter red region is the lower mantle. And then we get to the outer core and the inner core. So that's just trying to show you in 3 dimensions what you're looking at. So the first question asks, does the velocity of P and S waves increase or decrease with increased depth in the lithosphere? So again, the lithosphere is just this brown part here, and the black line represents the speed of S waves, and the blue line represents speed of P waves. And so if you look just at the speed in the lithosphere, they both go from left to right as it gets deeper. And that means they're going from lower to higher speeds as they get deeper. You have to drop down and read the scale. So the answer is that they are increasing with increasing depth in the lithosphere. What are their approximate velocities at the bottom of the lithosphere? So this is right at this point right here. So it's about 4.5 for the S waves, and right here it's about 8 for the P waves. So 4.5 and 8 are the answers for the question 2. Does the velocity of the P waves and S wave increase or decrease immediately below the lithosphere? And I'm going to remove those green arrows so you can see better. Take a look at what happens right below that lithosphere. Things move back. Okay, so they slow down. So I'm going to let you answer that. And that's what you're going to do for the rest of the questions. Read the questions carefully, look at the graph, try to understand how the speeds of these waves are changing as they pass into different parts of the Earth's interior. And it goes all the way to question 11. And that's it. Finally, you're going to move on to the lab report. You're not going to do all of the questions. Question number 2 sometimes gives students a hard time. They want you to draw a typical seismogram in which the first P wave arrives 3 minutes ahead of an S wave and 8 minutes ahead of a surface wave. So each of these are minutes. So what I suggest is draw a P wave beginning right about here at this minute mark. And it says the first P wave arrives 3 minutes ahead of the first S wave. So here's my P wave, and then I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, and that's where I'm going to draw my S wave. So you're going to want to kind of draw a low squiggle and then make an S wave right here. And then the S wave, and 8 minutes ahead of the first surface. So from the P, you're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and you're going to make your surface wave. So just make sure it matches what's asked about here. You're going to skip question 3, and then you're going to answer the rest of these questions. You're going to also skip question 8, and you're going to answer the ones here and also on question 10. I think most of these are pretty straightforward. A lot of them are a review of what we've already done in lab. So I think you should be able to answer these without any problem. If not, come ask during office hours. And that's it for earthquakes and Earth's interior.